Hello everyone, my name is Courtney Tassin and today I will be talking with you about vicarious trauma. We'll be talking about a few different things, but the focuses we're going to have are defining vicarious trauma, identifying the causes of it, understanding the impact of vicarious trauma, and then listing some strategies to prevent and recover from vicarious trauma. So let's start with that definition. A widely accepted definition of vicarious trauma is the emotional impact of working with those who've experienced traumatic situations. It often occurs through exposure to retelling and materials that are related to that traumatic event. You can probably imagine that mental health professionals, especially mental health first responders, are pretty susceptible to this. And this is really a core piece of our work that we do. A lot of people call vicarious trauma a symptom of extreme empathy. And some related concepts to vicarious trauma are compassion fatigue and burnout. Compassion fatigue and burnout are a little bit different than vicarious trauma, but they're often closely associated. And when referencing vicarious trauma, many people will also bring up compassion fatigue and burnout. Compassion fatigue is a little bit more of the diminished ability to empathize and feeling compassion due to that prolonged exposure to someone's suffering or various sufferings. And burnout is more of the physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion from chronic work stress. So as you can imagine, they all kind of tie into each other, but we'll talk a little bit more about vicarious trauma today as that'll be our focus. So what causes vicarious trauma? When we talk about vicarious trauma, there's tons of different causes as far as the type of traumatic events that you're listening to your clients talk about. But the core piece of vicarious trauma and what causes it is repeated exposure to very intense retellings of someone's traumatic events. So people who are within helper professions, which we'll talk about a little bit later, are especially at risk. We're constantly being the person, that listening ear for people who've experienced traumatic events. This is especially true for crisis workers. Oftentimes when we're working with someone and talking with them, we're being exposed to the things that they've encountered in their life that got them to that specific moment. So we're often exposed to that traumatic retelling. There are a lot of different ways that people can develop vicarious trauma outside of just the retelling of traumatic events. A really big piece that contributes to vicarious trauma is having poor boundaries and having a poor work-life balance with yourself. So we'll talk through some of the signs and symptoms, and again, those prevention strategies a little bit later on in the PowerPoint. Let's start off with what the signs and symptoms are of vicarious trauma. You'll see we have it broken down into 5 different sections here. You can imagine that vicarious trauma can affect every single part of your life and your day-to-day functioning. It's really important that we recognize that just because someone is experiencing some of these things doesn't mean someone does have vicarious trauma or is struggling with vicarious trauma. Each of these symptoms can help provide a picture for what maybe to look for if we're trying to identify someone who is maybe struggling with vicarious trauma, or within ourselves to understand and check in. The presence of these don't necessarily indicate this struggling with vicarious trauma though. Vicarious trauma, again, affects every single part of us often, and it can manifest very differently in different people. So some people might have every single one of these signs and symptoms listed here, and some might have just a few. It's very specific to the person, just like most mental health diagnoses and things that we see within the field. The emotional effects can look very different. We see a lot of that hypervigilance and a lot of emotional numbing and detachment. We see that irritability and intrusive thoughts, and it almost looks like a post-traumatic stress disorder sometimes. We're seeing some cognitive things that people are struggling with, like difficulty concentrating and maybe even some memory problems. The physical aspects, especially in this realm, are some physical tension and sleep disturbances. They might even struggle to maintain a healthy appetite. A lot of interpersonal difficulties can stem from vicarious trauma as well. Difficulty trusting others, wanting to isolate, having that reduced compassion and empathy, that inability to empathize with others. And all of that, as you can imagine, directly impacts our professional life. We might have decreased job satisfaction. We might have avoidance with the work we're doing every day. We don't want to hear more trauma, so we find ways to avoid it. People might be taking more and more time off, and maybe they're even showing up or not showing up to work. We see a lot of increased burnout and turnover as well when it comes to vicarious trauma. There are quite a few risk factors. You can see here all of them lined up. I think some of the biggest ones are a personal history of trauma. When we're listening to others tell us about their traumatic events, and we already have our own traumatic experiences that maybe we're still processing and working through, it continues to compound and compound and compound, which again leads us to that vicarious trauma piece and makes us a little more susceptible to that vicarious trauma. Having isolation, of course, is going to contribute because maybe we don't have a good support system to help prevent some of that vicarious trauma. Being overworked and overwhelmed, which falls in line with working with too many clients and working for poor pay or under stressful conditions, all contribute to vicarious trauma because if we're already struggling, we're already feeling a little overwhelmed, the addition of more traumatic input or the addition of more distressing feelings is probably going to emphasize and exacerbate some of those feelings we might be having from the emotional stress of working with our clients. Having limited professional experience, not having enough exposure to these kinds of events, or maybe having lack of supervision on how to process and handle traumatic retellings and things like that. Having a limited understanding and training about vicarious trauma as well. If we don't know what it is, if we don't know how to prevent it, it's very difficult for us to actively take those steps, of course. And then as we talked about in the last few slides, just working with populations who are more traumatized, especially those who are underserved or disadvantaged. So who is at risk? This is not an exhaustive list, of course, but you will see here 4 different helper professions which revolve around being exposed to someone else's trauma and having to listen. A core part of our job is listening to someone retell that trauma. So you'll see here we have therapists, first responders, domestic and sexual violence advocates, and healthcare workers. These people are often very directly related with people in crisis as well. So it makes sense that these professions might be a little more at risk for developing vicarious trauma if they don't take the steps to protect themselves. You might be asking yourself, what is the impact of vicarious trauma? Why do I need to be aware of what it is, and why do I need to make it important to try and prevent it within myself? We talked a little bit about the signs and symptoms and how that spans across our daily functioning in pretty much every area of our life. The impact of that is exactly the same. The impact is found within every single section of our life. We talked through those signs and symptoms, and of course that is the impact as well. But when we're looking at the emotional impact, people who are first responders or therapists are regularly witnessing and hearing about traumatic events, and it might evoke a range of emotional reactions in themselves. They can even develop symptoms of depression or maybe even symptoms that are parallel to post-traumatic stress. You'll see that increased stress and burnout, which might actually lead to emotional exhaustion, that reduced job satisfaction, feeling overwhelmed, and even wanting to leave the profession as a whole. Which again brings us to that impaired professional functioning. If we can't be effective within our own mental health and protect ourselves, it's going to show in the work we do, especially when we are in helper professions where we're working with clients who are in a very vulnerable state. A lot of times vicarious trauma results in people struggling to empathize, or again, feeling that avoidance for other traumatic retellings, not wanting to give your all to a client or give enough time and work with a client because you're feeling that vicarious trauma so much that it's truly impacting your ability to relate and work with them and provide high quality care. It can also affect how someone is responding in emergency situations. If you're a mental health first responder and you find yourself in maybe a more dangerous situation, it could lead to fight, flight, or freeze. And a lot of times with vicarious trauma, we do see the freeze reaction. Physical health effects are a very big part of this as well. We know that psychosomatic symptoms are a very real piece of mental health. This is especially true for vicarious trauma and other trauma-related disorders. This can look like chronic fatigue, sleep disturbance, maybe even gastrointestinal issues, and compromised immune function. I know that if you're like me, you've been very stressed and you find yourself getting sick. It's because our body is trying so hard to keep up with our mind that eventually it just makes us get sick because we can't take care of ourselves. We see a lot of the interpersonal difficulties that we talked about earlier. Again, it looks like being socially withdrawn, reduced emotional availability, could even lead to difficulties with your home relationships with your partner, your children, your family members, even close friends. we see often with vicarious trauma this change in worldview to a more negative and more cynical worldview, a belief that the world is dangerous or hostile. Maybe we don't feel safe in the world, so we have this big mistrust, and it can make us more cynical, and which is really hard to do our job when we feel that way. If we're responding to people on their worst day, and we're already going on with this preconceived mindset that is maybe more negative in nature, are we really going to be able to serve that client to the highest ability? A lot of times we also see that secondary traumatic stress, so the impact of being repeatedly exposed to those traumatic retellings, again, can mimic symptoms that look like PTSD. It's really important that we understand the impact, understand the signs and symptoms, so that we can take the proactive steps to actually address and manage that vicarious trauma so that it doesn't affect our life in a negative way, potentially a life-changing way. If we're impacted so much by this vicarious trauma that it's affecting our personal relationships, our work life, we might get ourselves into a rut, into a spot that might be very difficult to climb out of. So that proactive approach is so important, and it's going to absolutely affect the rest of your life and help promote well-being within your professional, personal, and emotional life. So what does prevention even look like? We'll talk about 4 key people within the prevention strategies for vicarious trauma: the self, of course, your coworkers, your supervisors, and your loved ones. So for the self side of the house, these are probably things you've all been told, probably things that you hear in mainstream media because they work and they're effective. So that's why we see these repeated so often. You'll see seeking therapeutic services is a very common recommendation. I think anyone within a helper field should be engaging in some sort of therapeutic service. It gives us an unbiased person to process and work through all of the emotional distress and things that we encounter in our day-to-day life so that we can better serve our clients. Taking advantage of your PTO, giving yourself mental health days, taking time away from work so that you can process and kind of have some reprieve, which goes into our next one of building strong social supports outside of work. If you're like me, anytime you're with your coworkers, you're talking about work, even when you're outside of work. If you constantly surround yourself with work content, it's very, very difficult to truly take a step back and separate yourself from work and again, get that reprieve so that you can process. If you're inside the storm, it's very difficult to manage the storm. We want to do it before it gets here. Engaging in activities outside of work, maybe that looks like hiking or spending time with your pets or your partner, doing things that are completely unrelated to work. So oftentimes with law enforcement, maybe some of them are interested in going to the gun range. That's still very closely associated to their work life. So we encourage them to do things even outside of that, again, like hiking and other things. A very intentional self-care is needed to prevent vicarious trauma. You can't engage in self-care just after that vicarious trauma is starting to set in. We want to do it proactively and very intentionally. We'll talk a little more about self-care and resilience in the next few slides. So when we talk about self-care, everyone thinks bubble baths and face masks, or maybe they think of exercise. While yes, all of those things can be very helpful for self-care, there's a few other things that are kind of included in that, like having that healthy separation of work and home. Again, we want to make sure we have a good work-life balance and to be able to take a step back from our work life, from those distressing things and feelings that are coming up from work, have time at home to decompress, process, and do what you need to do. Maintaining your basic needs. A lot of times when we're talking to our clients, we're telling them, are you taking care of yourself? Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you drinking water? Someone once told me that humans are just basically more complicated plants, and I think that's very true. We need sunlight, we need food, and we need water. And of course, we need to maintain personal hygiene and things like that. But if we can meet our basic needs, our body doesn't have to work so hard to try and keep up. Exercise, as much as everyone hates to hear it, including myself, non-competitive cardiovascular exercise is the best way to reduce cortisol, the stress hormone within your body. So having that non-competitive cardiovascular exercise, you're decreasing the stress that's in your body, and you're able, again, to get some of those feelings out, and it puts things into more of a specific outlet so that you can release some of that tension. Coping skills for processing. There are a lot of people who struggle finding a coping skill that works for them. And I always inform my clients and my friends around me, coping skills are skills for a reason. You don't just start off being very good at them. It takes time, it takes practice. You don't kick a goal the very first time you try soccer ball into a goal the very first try. You had to practice and get there to do that. It's the same thing for coping skills. And you have to find the right coping skill for you. For you, journaling might not be your thing, but for the next person, that might be the most effective piece for them. So finding something that works for you. And lastly, advocating for yourself. If you're feeling overworked, if you're feeling like your caseload is too large, talk with your supervisor, advocate for yourself. If you need a day off, take that day off. No one knows you better than you, and it's up to you to talk about your needs. Next, we'll talk about building resilience. Resilience is really dynamic, and it requires that ongoing attention and practice. It's not just something you can do one time and say, all right, I am resilient now. It takes time, and you have to tailor these strategies, again, similar to coping skills, to you and what works for you. And if that vicarious trauma, even if you've tried to build resiliency, you've worked really hard at this, if it's starting to really significantly impact your well-being again, really consider seeing a therapist or someone who can really support you through that emotional process. Of course, we'll see self-care here, which is going to be a common theme across all of our prevention strategies. Practicing mindfulness and distress tolerance, these are core DBT or dialectical behavioral therapy modules or core pieces to that. I find it very helpful within my own life and my own practice. When we practice these things, it gives us an awareness of what's going on in our body and some tips and strategies so that we can take that distress, find tolerance within it, find a way to relieve it, and move on. Reflective practice is also a good thing to check in with yourself every now and then. How am I doing? How am I feeling? Was I feeling more avoidant and detached with this client than normal? Did I show up on that scene already kind of having some preconceived ideas? Checking in with yourself. Professional development, like trainings and things that make you maybe excited about work again, things to broaden your scope. Cultivating that meaning and purpose. You often hear you have to find your why. And it's cheesy, but it's true. Especially when you're feeling and struggling with vicarious trauma or just traumatization as a whole. Finding the why of why you entered the profession might be very different as opposed to why you stay. Might be very different as opposed to why you want to leave, right? There are a lot of pieces, but your why can be a big motivator for you to continue in the field. And again, utilizing that reflective practice to look back on your why. Say, why do I keep doing this? Is this something that is for me? If it's not for me, what do I need to do instead? Because it's also okay to take a step back and say, this isn't for me anymore, and I think I need a change. But if we can keep ourselves healthy and hopefully stay within this mentally healthy and ready state, maybe we don't have to leave the profession. And again, coping skills, which is going to be, again, a very common theme across all of this. Next, we'll talk about the role of loved ones within preventing vicarious trauma. You may be a loved one or a partner or a family member of someone who is also in a helper profession who gets exposed to traumatic events, and they might be suffering with vicarious trauma. Or you might be curious about what your loved ones can do for you. I think the biggest one is just being a listening ear, being someone that they can vent to and talk to and be a support system for. Encouraging self-care within them. So all of the things we just talked about, encouraging that within them. And then encouraging that engagement in outside activities, explaining to them, hey, it's really hard to get away from work if you're constantly at work. You need to take some time away. Maintaining a daily life routine is also very helpful to be able to maintain, helps take away some of the ambiguity or uncertainty that comes with the day-to-day, which can really be helpful in stabilizing someone who's suffering with traumatization. And if you are concerned about your loved one, be very open and tell them, hey, I'm concerned. I've been noticing that you're struggling, and do you want to talk about it? And then lastly, encourage seeking help from a professional. For coworkers, there's a lot of things we can do as well. And I think the biggest one is fostering a supportive work environment. If your work environment's hostile, it only adds to the stress that you're feeling and can further that traumatization or the distress on top of that vicarious trauma you might already be feeling. Promoting self-care in the workplace. There's plenty of different programs and things that people do, but promoting that within your coworkers. Encouraging healthy boundaries. Hey, I noticed that you're working after hours a lot and you're responding to emails on days you're off. I'm worried about you and want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Normalize help seeking. If you go to therapy and it's worked for you, talk about it. Try to avoid using stigmatizing language. All of these little things might be kind of the light bulb that goes off for another person. Looking out for one another, again, recognizing those signs and symptoms in each other, and then involving a supervisor when it's necessary. Maybe someone is so far down on that vicarious trauma path that it's really starting to affect their clients or the way they're showing up to work. Lastly, we'll talk about supervisors and their way of being able to prevent vicarious trauma. When you're doing formal supervision, especially for clinicians, bringing up vicarious trauma and talking about it in a theoretical framework, but also in a practical framework, being able to bring your real life examples to that session could be really helpful. Something that we do within my team is a formal debriefing session after every single person experiences their first deceased victim or their deceased person on scene, big things like that. We host a formal debriefing session to be able to talk through what's going on in their brain, help them process, and make sure that we offer them any of the resources and support that we have. Encouraging the use of PTO. It can be very stressful as a supervisor having to manage when people are out, and I understand that. But also, by encouraging the use of PTO and not vilifying it, we're promoting a sense of wellness within our staff and hopefully promote longevity within the role. Creating emotional and physical space for processing. Part of being a supervisor is being available. Sometimes being available is just holding space for someone and letting them know that you're a safe place to go to. Seek out training opportunities for yourself, but also for your staff. Get trained up in vicarious trauma. Get trained up in leadership for traumatic professions, things like that. And then help encourage that supportive work environment. Don't contribute to the hostility that might be occurring or any kinds of cliques. Make it a supportive work environment where people can freely speak what's happening in their lives. So to wrap it all up, let's talk kind of about what we covered today. Vicarious trauma, at its core, stems from extreme empathy, and it's a symptom of extreme empathy, especially within helper professions. Vicarious trauma can be detrimental. If you don't manage it, it can affect your personal life, your professional life, and every bit of your functioning. We want to make sure that we're being proactive. There's a lot of risk factors that can increase someone's susceptibility to vicarious trauma, a lot of that being poor work-life balance, poor boundaries, and having your own trauma history or trauma background as well. Prevention often requires that whole of community approach. We talked about 4 different key people who are involved within the prevention process. When you look at the person that we're working with, yourself maybe, those are the main people that surround you. Without each one of them actively playing a role in that prevention piece or that restorative piece, it might be a lot harder to recover from that. And then lastly, self-care is key and prevention and the recovery process of vicarious trauma. If we're not taking care of ourselves, we can't care for our clients. It's the cheesy cliche of you can't pour from an empty cup, and that's very true. We have to take those proactive steps to not only preventing, but recovering from vicarious trauma when we notice it. Thank you, and that's the end of my presentation.